Thanks, Denise. That was great. I'll start with a question. I was remarked to hear that Governor Cuomo of New York talked about building a seawall in New York Harbor after the hurricane, which I thought was a pretty remarkable statement to make. And I wonder, in the Gulf with Katrina and the oil spill, what's the appetite for preventative action, because they've lived through so many of these things? What's the sustainability mindset right now?
Relative to the kind of trade-off between environmental conditions and modifying it further, you mean?
You know, spending money.
Spending money.
Yeah, to do these things.
Well, I think that whenever Governor Cuomo is in the same position that Gulf Coast governors are in all too often, is realizing the expenditures which are made because we didn't act before the event, right? And so when you see that the damages associated with an event like Sandy, are now, I was out of town over the weekend, so $50 billion are we now discussing? The wall between Sandy Hook, I'm not advocating it at all. I think it's worth looking at what you could do with it, though, and see what kind of damages could be prevented by doing something
I guess
like
my question
that.
is,
I think it's worth considering.
In the Gulf Coast, is there a different? Do you find a different mindset because they've been through it so many more times?
No, well, I think it's the same realization that you pay now or you pay later. And I think that's what you see there. I think that's exactly what you hear across the Gulf Coast. I think the idea that you need some kind of immediate action is a very reasonable position. People get frustrated when it happens over and over again. How many times can people just be expected to pick up and hose their house out and change the appliances again, or lose whatever was under the house that was already elevated? I mean, how many times can you do that? I think there is a reasonable frustration, but so the issue here is that these are changing systems, and the recognition that we can't have it all, that there is some kind of trade-off there. If we want a bountiful natural system in coastal Louisiana that is a hugely productive ecosystem, then we have to be very careful about what we do with it in terms of building big walls across it and those kinds of things, because if we change it once more, then we will cause further ecosystem degradation. The issue about where the money comes from is I think, just a systemic issue about what we seem to be unwilling to pay for, but yet we all seem to want. Don't think I really want to go there.
Yes, please.
So I've been listening to all of these presentations, and there's a theme that seems to be running through all of them. That is that we do things and expect nature to behave differently. So we build intensively in low-lying areas and then expect water not to wash into them in a strong surge through these storms that are once in a century and are occurring 2 or 3 times in the same decade. Mm-hmm. Moreover, if you build a permanent structure, that surge has to go somewhere, and typically affects areas that would not have been affected because they're on higher ground. How would you deal with this in a sort of common sense way going forward? It seems like our human structures need to adapt, and I feel like I'm channeling Dick here. The problem is the built environment and where we're building, not nature.
Well, yes, it's really where we built, isn't it, really? I think that we have to make some tough decisions about where we are prepared to invest to maintain particular coast-dependent activities. And there are some things that, particularly port facilities, that really have to be close to the water. Frankly, major financial activities do not have to be close to the water. And so there are some kinds of functions of economy and society which can occur pretty much anywhere. And we should think strategically about ensuring that we do do whatever we can for the things that have to be down there by the water. We have to have ports. We have things like one of the key pieces of coastal infrastructure is refineries. There are a number of refineries on big flat land around the northern Gulf Coast, and similarly oil processing facilities in the New Jersey harbor region. They basically have to be close to the water, and they basically have to be on large areas of flat land. That's why people have lived and developed in coastal areas, for millennia, because there is abundant fresh water and flat land, and often very fertile land. I mean, it's not just the story of the US, it's the story of global civilization, really. So I think it's about being strategic, that we have to provide a way of undertaking those water-dependent operations and securing those in some way. And then, so it's not about moving everything. I think there are some things that we can't move, but we have to really get into this in a much more strategic thinking way about what the activities are that we're trying to continue to do. Sorry, that was a pretty long answer I think hopefully it made some sense. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Denise, for a great talk. Chris Bortier from CDC. Having grown up in Chauvin, Louisiana, first of all...
In Chauvin?
In Chauvin.
I live in Montague.
It does my heart such good to hear your Cajun accent.
It's good, isn't it? Yeah, I always say I'm from the east side.
Brings me right back home. And actually, the picture you showed, was that Ile
de Jean Charles. Yeah, see, I can say it, yeah. It was the Ile de Jean Charles. I took that picture, yeah.
I'll talk partially about that because that's an interesting case. That's a Native American population of subsistence fishermen. Mm-hmm. And they're sinking. Mm-hmm. And so you've got the cultural mixed in with it's an old population. It's been there a very long period of time. And so moving them is really a cultural problem, not just a financial one, not just a resources issue. But my question goes back to what you said earlier. You said it wasn't the Katrinas, it's the long-term destruction. But isn't it both? I mean, the marsh along the Louisiana coast and many of the areas along the Gulf Coast has been weakened through our poor management of it. And when these extreme events come in, they devastate it. They really make large inroads into the destruction of these areas. So it's kind of both, isn't it?
Yes, it is. They're not independent of one another, but the idea of the effect on communities of the big events, I think, is much greater than their effect on the coast. I think I didn't spend a lot of time on explaining why Louisiana is falling apart, but one of the fundamental issues is control of the Mississippi River. That the Delta used to swing around and build land in one place and overflow its banks and all those kinds of things, and we've cut all this land where you were brought up and where I now live away from the river. We've cut it off from the river. One of the cruel ironies of South Louisiana is that one of the best sources of sediment for our marshes to help them keep their head above the water in the face of sea level rise is storms. They actually pick up the sediment and push it in from the Gulf, if you like, these days, because we've cut off the source from the river at the top. And so we almost kind of need the storms. We need the cold fronts. We need the tropical storms. We need the big to bring that sediment in. If we didn't have them, our marshes would actually be in worse shape than they are now. And I do think that once the system is weakened, they are more vulnerable to storm damage as far as the wetlands are concerned. And so if we have healthy, intact marshes across the Gulf Coast, they will be more resilient to storm damage, and they will be in a better position to provide what protective services they can over time. An interesting story about this community at the end of the road where I showed the truck in the water is called Ile de Jean Charles, as the gentleman says, is a Native American community that has gradually been degraded. I've lived there for 25 years, and after these events, the storms that you won't remember, Tropical Storm Bob, Hurricane Lily, you're not going to remember those. They weren't headliners. But people gradually move. And after every storm, a few people give up, and they move up the bayou. And the chief for that community, Albert Nacker, has really made a push to relocate the people that are left. And he's trying to convince the people that are left to take the deal, to actually move as one, to get relocated together, not for you to go with your cousin over there and for you to go with your daughter-in-law over there, but to actually relocate together and go to a place where they could have a community center or a school or something like that. Because one of the challenges of the communities down where I live is that the people move individually and then the community becomes unviable because the school gets closed or the church closes or those kinds of things, and then it all just kind of disintegrates in place. And so, and I think that the idea of these higher frequency events that really, they might not destroy your house, but they destroy the quality of life that really, means that people just give up after a point. I think there are some very interesting lessons learned, not just the disaster ones, but these ongoing things that they're subject to.
Linda.
So in many ways, Denise, you answered my question with your last comments. I found myself very torn by your presentation because I've always been an advocate to help people stay in their communities and withstand things that are hitting them. But your slide showing by 2050 the red areas, I just don't think that's a sustainable. I think we're past anything to sustain those areas. And so I think it would be interesting to know how much of the movement is occurring. I mean, how sparsely populated is those areas in red now, and how many human beings are we really talking about living in those areas?
Well, it's interesting. Some of the community, they have different character. And so thinking about the future of those communities, you have to, some of them are subsistence fishermen, but others basically work in the oil and gas industry or commute into, the local city, or run charter fishing, or they're basically recreational communities where the resident population is very low and the houses that are very elegant and smart all belong to, doctors and lawyers from Baton Rouge who come down and go fishing on the weekend. So there's even though they're dots on the map now, I think that they actually are changing. And this idea of change, I think, applies to the communities as much as it does to the coastal landscapes. And when you talk, the people there don't do the same kinds of things that they did 2 generations ago. My mother-in-law was, is from the area down near where and she will tell stories of how, her family used to go out and really did live off the land. And there are very, very few people who do that anymore. And it's not just because the landscape is degraded, it's because our society has essentially changed in coastal Louisiana as in many other places. And so there is this kind of romantic notion of the past. And I think that although there are some key elements of that which should certainly not be dismissed, I think that the key of this is planning for the future and having a reasonable expectation of what we can do in the future in our coastal areas. And that's a reasonable expectation about what restored wetlands can do for you. It's a reasonable expectation about what the jobs in the economy might be too.
Well, thank you for that superb presentation, and just the mixture of science and looking at the community. I'm Bernie Goldstein. One of the hats I wear is to chair the Gulf Region Health Outreach Program, which is part of the medical settlement. One of the issues that we face often is the question of the role of science and technology and how much we can improve things with better science and technology. You showed us a projection that's 40 years ahead through a commission that you were part of. To what extent did the commission assume that the ability to do things was not going to change? To what extent did it assume that maybe we would get better? if we invested some in better understanding of what's happening and better processes to improve things. Was that part of your consideration?
Yeah, actually, that was really what the study was about. The two maps that I showed you were what we call the future without action, right? The baseline projection into the future without doing anything. And so then we looked at how we could change that if we spend a total of $50 billion over 50 years. Like that money was just going to magically appear and we were going to be able to build projects now instead of being caught up in permits and essential fish habitat negotiations. I've got to look at Paul behind you for 5 years. So we did a kind of fairly idealized kind of analysis about that. And what we showed was if you spent the money, you could have a different future, but you certainly couldn't go back.
So I probably haven't phrased the question well.
I'm sorry.
Did any part of that money, was any part of that money presumed to be spent on doing a better job of getting the science and technology to improve where you're going, or did it just assume you were going to spend $50 billion using today's techniques?
Well, you know, I think that I don't want to get into the you don't know what you don't know kind of thing, but I think we basically were applying the science that we have now, but we are, one of the things that the Water Institute for the Gulf is actually just designing at the moment is a coastal innovation program to actually really try to get some innovation into the ideas of how we can move things out faster, obviously cheaper, but also with more reliable outcomes. You know, what kind of design considerations could we put into things? What kind of technologies might be out there? And clearly, planning 50 years into the future is kind of necessary in order to be able to think. You don't want to think too short term, but even though the plan is 50 years that came out in 2012, the work we're doing now on the early implementation is really looking just 15 to 20 out. Just because we know things are going to change in the future. So, no, I mean, innovation is, it could make a real difference. It could make a real difference. Unfortunately, the great technological innovations of the 20th century made a big difference in coastal Louisiana in the wrong way. And so we just have to try and steer things a bit better.
Denise, one quick final comment. I guess I'll be the last. This is Paul Sandifer. It was great job. I really hope you'll continue to spread the message of the potential for restored or conserved wetlands to help us deal with the ongoing aggravations of climate change and sea level rise. This is one of those big things. You talked about these routine sort of events. And your friend and mine, Margaret Davidson, and her crew did a marvelous job a couple of years ago of modeling what the impacts of sea level rise might be in Charleston, South Carolina, and my home. And they looked at another kind of low-lying place, you know, a mountain that's 25 feet plus. So they did a marvelous job of estimating and showing that the effects of tidal flooding would increase from a couple of days a year to as much as 100 days a year. And this got brought home in a really big way this past summer when we have these marvelous pictures on national news showing kayakers in the market area of downtown Charleston. That's the tourist area of downtown Charleston on the afternoon high tide that just happened to be an astronomical high tide, an onshore wind, and a rainstorm. You know, for us, a normal, nasty, big thunderstorm, frog-strangling thunderstorm. But we had water in all the stores, kayaks in the street. The crosstown connector was closed for hours and hours. This is the sort of daily aggravation you talked about, and where having both cognizance of sea level rise and other associated climate effects and what they can mean, and then beginning to think about restoring an environment around to help try to deal with some of those things, as well as building the hard infrastructure that's going to be necessary to protect things like roads.
Yeah. I think that's exactly the kind of thing that, and I could go into the details about why those events, you know, why things like marshes can make more difference to events like that. But I won't go into that in a lot of detail now. But I do think that the idea, one of the lessons that we get from Hurricane Isaac and the analysis that we've done from that is this idea that that how long an event lasts makes quite a lot of difference. And it's when the storm sits there for a long time that it can really pile things in. We also did, I say we, the Corps did the analysis, we just reviewed the report, it just came out last week. They also looked at the effect of rainfall flooding. And we can pass these things out now. We can pass out rainfall, we can pass out the tide, and we can pass out the storm surge, and we can put them together in different kinds of combinations. And scientifically, we do this in this really horrible kind of statistical manner to produce the 100-year event. And really, I think what we want to do in Louisiana is perhaps what you can do in Charleston is not think about the 100-year event and what marshes can do for the 100-year event. But think about Hurricane Isaac. Everybody remembers Hurricane Isaac. If we had that project in place, how would that storm have been different? If you'd had that different circumstance in Charleston, how would that event that everybody remembers be different? I think one of the things we do as scientists, as bureaucrats and all those, we have to kind of look at the average event, or the 100-year event. And those events never occur. People don't remember this. People don't relate to them. But they relate to Sandy, they relate to Isaac, they relate to Katrina. And so in terms of communicating, we have to think about how we can use our science to build these predictions together, but build them around things, not that our science tells us to do, but that people can then relate to. We do both. We have to understand the 100-year event, but we also have to understand how Isaac could have been different. And I think that there's a real communication thing with events, because people remember the events. They won't remember whether it was a 100-year storm.
Excellent. Thank you, Denise.
Okay, thanks.
I want to thank everybody today for the wonderful talks, wonderful questions and conversation that we've had, and what I think has been really more than what I even expected. I was really looking forward to this day, but it's just been fantastic, and I know that tomorrow is going to be wonderful as well, so I hope you all come back. Have a wonderful evening. We'll see you in the morning. Bye-bye.